Hey everybody, we made it to season 23, which has no theme, so it's kind of a free-for-all. So hit like, subscribe, leave a comment, do whatever you want, just be safe. Famous lynchings in America represent one of the darkest chapters in the nation's history, with over 4,400 documented cases occurring between 1877 and 1950 alone, though lynchings are not limited to that time frame. Those acts of racial terror weren't random outbursts of violence, but rather calculated public spectacles designed to enforce racial hierarchy through fear. Historical lynchings have left an indelible mark on American society, particularly in the South, where the majority of the atrocities took place. Unfortunately, many U.S. lynching cases remained unpunished, with perpetrators often acting with impunity and sometimes even local law enforcement participation. The brutal nature of those incidents of racial violence, frequently involving torture, mutilation, and public displays of victims, makes these stories especially horrifying. Despite efforts to suppress or minimize this history, researchers and historians have meticulously documented these cases, preserving the truth for future generations. The only way to learn from our history is to remember it accurately. This is Monsters. Before we begin, I just want to make sure you know that my other show, Sinister, is back up and there are 3 episodes a week. They're dark stories from history, and if you like this show, you'll probably like that one. Give it a shot. There are links in the description. Thanks. The murder of 14-year-old Emmett Till stands as one of the most pivotal famous lynchings in America, igniting widespread outrage that helped catalyze the civil rights movement. Unlike many historical lynchings that faded from public memory, Emmett Till's case forced the nation to confront the brutal reality of racial violence in the Jim Crow South. Born on July 25, 1941, Emmett Louis Till grew up in Chicago, Illinois. As a northern black youth, Emmett was unaccustomed to the severe racial segregation he would encounter in Mississippi. During summer vacation in August of 1955, the teenager traveled to the Mississippi Delta region to visit relatives near Money, Mississippi. His mother, Mamie Till, concerned about her son's playful nature, specifically warned him that white people in the South could react violently to behavior that was normally tolerated in the North. On August 24, 1955, Emmett and several teenagers visited Bryant's grocery and meat market after a long day working in the cotton fields. What happened inside remains disputed, but Emmett allegedly spoke to or whistled at 21-year-old Carolyn Bryant, the white married proprietor. That interaction, however innocent, violated the unwritten code of behavior for black males interacting with white females in the segregated South. Subsequently, in the early morning hours of August 28th, Roy Bryant, Carolyn's husband, and his half-brother J.W. Milam forced their way into Moses Wright's home where Emmett was staying. Armed with pistols, they abducted the boy at gunpoint. They brutally beat him, gouged out one of his eyes, and shot him in the head before tying his body to a large metal fan with barbed wire and dumping it in the Tallahatchie River. 3 days later, Emmett Till's mutilated and bloated body was discovered and retrieved from the river. Emmett's body was returned to Chicago, where his mother made the courageous decision to hold an open casket funeral. The open coffin funeral held by Mamie exposed the world to more than her son's bloated, mutilated body. Her decision focused attention on not only American racism and the barbarism of lynching, but also the limitations and vulnerabilities of American democracy. Tens of thousands attended the funeral or viewed his open casket. The trial of Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam began on September 19, 1955. Despite Moses Wright's extraordinary courage in standing up in court and identifying the 2 white men who had kidnapped Emmett, an all-white, all-male jury acquitted them after deliberating for merely 67 minutes. Protected from double jeopardy, Bryant and Milam later admitted in a 1956 interview with Look magazine that they had tortured and murdered Emmett Till, selling their confession for $4,000. The murder became a catalyst for the civil rights movement. Just 100 days after his death, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus. When asked later why she didn't move to the back, she responded, quote, "I thought about Emmett Till and I just couldn't go back." The Women's Political Council called for a citywide bus boycott and enlisted the help of a young minister named Martin Luther King Jr. The brutal lynching of Emmett Till forced Americans nationwide to confront the reality of racial violence in the South, creating what Joyce Ladner termed the, quote, Emmett Till generation. Young African Americans inspired to join the growing movement for civil rights. Among the most thoroughly documented famous lynchings in America, the 1916 killing of Jesse Washington in Waco, Texas, became known as the Waco Horror due to its exceptionally public and brutal nature. Jesse Washington was a 17-year-old African-American farmhand who worked on the cotton farm of George and Lucy Fryer in Robinson, Texas, a small community near Waco. Described as illiterate and possibly intellectually disabled, Jesse had been employed at the Fryers' farm for approximately 5 months before the incident. On May 8, 1916, Lucy Fryer, a 53-year-old white woman, was found bludgeoned to death in the doorway of her farm's seed shed with signs of sexual assault. Local men quickly suspected Jesse, as one claimed to have seen him near the Fryer house shortly before the discovery of Lucy's body. Sheriff Samuel Fleming and his deputies arrested Jesse that same night, finding him wearing blood-stained overalls, which he claimed resulted from a nosebleed. Following questioning without legal representation or parental presence, Jesse eventually confessed to killing Lucy Fryer after an argument about her mules. The confession was published in Waco newspapers the following day. On May 15, 1916, Jesse Washington's trial began in the McClellan County Courthouse before a packed audience of over 2,000 spectators. The proceedings lasted merely 1 hour, with the jury deliberating for just 4 minutes before delivering a guilty verdict. Before court officers could remove Jesse, spectators seized him and dragged him outside where a growing mob awaited. What followed was one of the most horrific public spectacles in American history. The mob stripped the teen, beat him repeatedly, and placed a chain around his neck. They dragged him towards Waco City Hall, where a bonfire had been prepared. In front of an estimated crowd of 10,000 to 15,000 people, including the mayor, police chief, and children released from school for lunch, Jesse was tortured, mutilated, and burned alive. Particularly disturbing was the celebratory atmosphere among spectators, with reports of shouts of delight as they watched a human being be burned alive. The mob repeatedly raised and lowered his body into the flames over approximately 2 hours. After his death, participants collected souvenirs, including his fingers, toes, teeth, and even genitalia. His charred remains were later dragged through town behind an automobile. That was not an act of justice. That was an act of torture carried out by severely disturbed individuals. The priority was not to get justice for Lucy Fryer. It was to cause immense suffering on a human being, and that pain was celebrated by people who should be put into the category of worst criminal murderers in history. The lynching of Jesse Washington marked a turning point in how such atrocities were perceived nationally. Professional photographer Fred Gildersleeve captured images of the lynching in progress and created postcards of the event. Those rare photographs documenting a lynching in progress became powerful evidence in anti-lynching campaigns. Following the incident, newspapers across America and abroad condemned the lynching. The New York Times stated that, quote, "In no other land even pretending to be civilized could a man be burned to death in the streets of a considerable city amid the savage exultation of its inhabitants." Even Southern newspapers that had previously defended lynchings criticized the barbarity of the Waco mob. Most significantly, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, launched a full investigation of the lynching. Author W.E.B. Du Bois published a detailed report with photographs in The Crisis magazine, calling it the Waco Horror. The NAACP utilized that case as the cornerstone in their campaign for federal anti-lynching legislation. Despite widespread condemnation, no one was ever prosecuted for Jesse's murder. The brutal killing of Mary Turner in May of 1918 remains one of the most horrific famous lynchings in America, notable for its exceptional cruelty toward a pregnant woman who simply spoke out against injustice. The case exemplifies how racial violence extended beyond just black men to target women and even unborn children. Mary Graham was born in December of 1899 to Perry Graham and Elizabeth Johnson, a sharecropping family. In February of 1917, at age 17, she married Hazel Turner, who went by Hayes, in Colquitt County, Georgia. The couple had 2 children before marriage and subsequently moved to Brooks County, Georgia, where they worked for plantation owner Hampton Smith. Smith had a reputation for mistreating workers, often bailing black people out of jail for minor offenses and forcing them to work off their debts on his property. After Mary Turner was severely beaten by Smith and her husband threatened retaliation, Hayes was sent to work on a chain gang. On May 16, 1918, Hampton Smith was murdered by Sidney Johnson, a black worker who had been forced to work off a fine for quote-unquote rolling dice. That incident triggered a week-long rampage that resulted in at least 11 African Americans being lynched in Brooks and Lowndes counties. Hayes Turner, though uninvolved in Smith's murder, was among those targeted. After his lynching on May 18th, Mary Turner, 8 months pregnant at the time, publicly denounced her husband's killing and threatened legal action against the perpetrators. Enraged by her defiance, a mob of several hundred people captured her the following day near Folsom Bridge at the Little River. What followed was horrifying. The mob tied her ankles, hung her upside down from a tree, doused her clothes with gasoline, and set her ablaze. While still alive, Mary's abdomen was cut open with a butcher knife, causing her unborn child to fall to the ground. A member of the mob crushed the baby's head with his foot. How very pro-life of him. Finally, her body was riddled with hundreds of bullets. Mary Turner and her baby were buried near the site, with only a whiskey bottle marking the grave. The lynching of Mary Turner and her unborn child prompted national outrage. 10 days after the incident, the Colored Federated Clubs of Augusta sent a resolution to President Woodrow Wilson requesting justice. Moreover, the case became instrumental in the NAACP's campaign for federal anti-lynching legislation, prompting Missouri Congressman Leonidas Dyer to craft the 1922 Dyer Anti-Lynching Bill. Although the bill passed the U.S. House of Representatives in 1922, it did not become law until December of 2018 because of opposition from Southern Democratic senators. Now, let's have a quick history lesson about the ideologies of American Democrat and Republican parties. Basically, what you know of their ideologies today should be reversed for anything that happened prior to the Great Depression. So if someone tells you that Republicans wanted to free the slaves or that Democrats created Jim Crow, you can basically switch the names of the parties. Prior to the Great Depression, rich businessmen took control of the Republican Party that had been historically for individual rights and made it about prioritizing profit over human life. That was fine until the economy crashed in 1932 and a Democrat, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who ran on a platform of intervening in the crisis with financial assistance, won in a landslide. But there still wasn't a complete split in the ideologies between the parties at the time. The split was between the North and the South. Representatives from southern states, both Democrat and Republican, opposed racial equality, while representatives from northern states, both Democrat and Republican, supported racial equality. It wasn't until the Civil Rights Act was signed into law by Democratic President Lyndon B. Johnson in 1964 did the parties really solidify their stance on civil rights. During that time, Republican candidate Barry Goldwater publicly opposed the new law, arguing that it expanded the power of the federal government to a dangerous level. That history of the Democrat and Republican parties is referred to as the Great Switch, and it should be kept in mind when talking about what each party supported in the past. Throughout the decades following her murder, Mary Turner's story continued to resonate. In letters to Presidents Roosevelt and others, citizens referred to her case as evidence of America's failure to address lynching. In 2010, a historical marker was placed near the lynching site, though it had to be removed in 2020 due to repeated vandalism and was temporarily replaced with a large steel cross. Because again, there are people out there who are bitter that we consider lynching a black spot on American history. Currently, organizations like the Mary Turner Project continue working to preserve her memory and promote racial healing. The 1915 murder of Leo Frank stands out as the only documented lynching of a Jewish person among famous lynchings in America, highlighting how anti-Semitism intersected with racial violence history in the early 20th century. Leo Max Frank, born in Texas and raised in New York, earned a mechanical engineering degree from Cornell University before moving to Atlanta in 1908. As superintendent of the National Pencil Factory and president of Atlanta's B'nai B'rith chapter, Frank represented the northern Jewish business presence in the South. On April 26, 1913, 13-year-old factory worker Mary Fagan was found murdered in the factory basement after visiting to collect her $1.20 paycheck. Frank, the last person to acknowledge seeing her alive, became the prime suspect despite thin evidence. Following a sensational trial where crowds outside the courthouse cheered the prosecutor daily, Frank was convicted and sentenced to death. After multiple failed appeals reaching the Supreme Court, Georgia Governor John Slayton reviewed over 10,000 pages of documentation and commuted Frank's sentence to life in prison in June of 1915. Furious at that decision, protesters marched on the governor's mansion, forcing him to declare martial law. On August 16, 1915, a group of 25 prominent citizens calling themselves the Knights of Mary Fagan kidnapped Frank from the state prison farm in Milledgeville. Frank had previously survived a throat slashing by another prisoner. The lynch mob drove him approximately 100 miles or 160 kilometers to Marietta, Mary Fagan's hometown. At 7:05 a.m. on August 17th, they hanged him from an oak tree. Within 90 minutes, a crowd of roughly 3,000 people gathered, with some taking pieces of Frank's clothing as souvenirs. The lynching had far-reaching consequences for U.S. lynching cases in American society. Notably, the men who lynched Frank, including a former governor, state legislator, and other prominent citizens, were never prosecuted. After that, those same individuals subsequently gathered atop Stone Mountain to burn a cross and revive the Ku Klux Klan. Simultaneously, the case spurred the formation of the Anti-Defamation League to combat anti-Semitism. For Georgia's Jewish community, the incident created a climate of fear that persisted for decades. Many Jews retreated from public life, and approximately half of Georgia's 3,000 Jewish residents fled the state. In 1986, the Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles granted Frank a posthumous pardon, acknowledging the state's failure to protect him and bring his killers to justice. That pardon came after Alonzo Mann, a former office boy, revealed in 1982 that he had seen the factory janitor carrying Mary Fagan's body on the day of her murder. The Will Brown case stands out among famous lynchings in America as a horrific incident within the Red Summer of 1919 when racial violence erupted across dozens of American cities. His murder exemplifies how false accusations coupled with political manipulation could unleash deadly mob violence. Will Brown was a 41-year-old African-American laborer who worked as a coal hustler in Omaha, Nebraska. Several accounts mention his severe rheumatism, which likely limited his physical mobility. His health condition made the accusations against him even more doubtful. Will lived in a house at 2418 South 5th Street with a white woman named Virginia Jones and another black man, Henry Johnson. On September 25, 1919, a white woman named Agnes Lobeck and her fiancé Milton Hoffman reported being assaulted. Agnes accused Will of sexually assaulting her, consequently prompting his arrest. Importantly, political tensions heightened the situation as Tom Dennison, Omaha's powerful political boss, utilized his newspaper, the Omaha Bee, to inflame racial hatred with sensationalist headlines calling Will a black beast. On September 28th, a mob estimated between 5,000 and 15,000 people surrounded the Douglas County Courthouse where Will was being held. As the situation escalated, rioters set fire to the courthouse, preventing firefighters from extinguishing the flames. Inside the burning building, Will reportedly pleaded, quote, "I am innocent. I never did it. My God, I am innocent." Once captured by the mob, Will was beaten unconscious, stripped naked, and hanged from a telephone pole at 18th and Harney Streets. Hundreds of people fired guns at his body. Subsequently, his corpse was tied behind an automobile, dragged through downtown streets, burned with fuel from red danger lamps, and pieces of rope were sold as souvenirs for 10 cents each. Following the lynching, the U.S. Army deployed 70 officers and 1,222 enlisted men, the largest military response to any racial riot of the period. Only after the public demanded action were approximately 120 participants apprehended and charged with crimes ranging from murder to arson. Still, nobody was convicted and eventually everyone was released without serving any time. The Duluth lynchings represent the northernmost documented case among famous lynchings in America, showing that racial violence was not confined to the South. Elias Clayton, Elmer Jackson, and Isaac McGee were young African-American men in their early 20s working as laborers with the John Robinson Circus, which was performing in Duluth, Minnesota. The men were part of a traveling workforce in a city where racial tension was high despite black residents comprising less than 1% of Duluth's population in 1920. Indeed, many white workers in northern industrial cities resented the presence of black workers during this era of black migration. On June 14, 1920, 19-year-old Irene Tuscan and 18-year-old James Sullivan, both white, attended the circus. Afterward, they claimed 6 black circus workers robbed them at gunpoint and sexually assaulted Irene. The next morning, Duluth Police Chief John Murphy arrested several African-American men, but a doctor's examination had found no evidence of sexual assault on Irene. As news spread, Louis Dondino organized an angry mob by driving around town calling people to join what he termed a necktie party. The crowd, estimated between 5,000 and 10,000 people, broke into the police station using bricks and clubs. Commissioner of Public Safety William Murnian instructed officers not to stop the rioters forcefully. The mob conducted a mock trial, declaring the men guilty, then dragged Elias, Elmer, and Isaac to a lamp post at 1st Street and 2nd Avenue where they were stripped, beaten, and strung up. The horrific scene included Isaac McGee being hanged twice after his rope broke. Afterwards, photographs showing smiling white spectators with the victims' bodies were made into souvenir postcards. The Minnesota National Guard arrived to secure the city and protect remaining black prisoners. News of the lynching spread nationwide, generating both outrage and support for the mob's actions. A grand jury indicted 37 white men, yet merely 3 were convicted of rioting, with none convicted of murder. Conversely, 7 African Americans were indicted for rape. That travesty prompted activist Nellie Francis to lobby for anti-lynching legislation, which Minnesota passed on April 21, 1921. For decades, the lynchings were largely forgotten until 1991 when the victims' graves received headstones reading, quote, "Deterred but not defeated." In 2003, a memorial honoring Elias Clayton, Elmer Jackson, and Isaac McGee was dedicated across from the lynching site. These cases represent merely a fraction of the racial terror that plagued American society for generations and is still celebrated by some. The cases share common elements: racism, intolerance, and a severe lack of education. They came into reality due to false accusations, denial of due process, extraordinary cruelty, and almost complete impunity for perpetrators. Those are a denial of rights that every human being who is standing on American soil gets, and nobody, not a single person or an angry mob, has the right to be judge, jury, and executioner. If you're outraged by any crime but okay with these examples of violent vigilante justice, then you're no better than the people you claim are criminals. Wanting a human being to be tortured and suffer unimaginable pain is not the desire of a good person. The United States was founded as a melting pot, so thinking that people with different origins, cultures, or skin colors shouldn't be living in the country is profoundly un-American. Carrying out unspeakable acts on other human beings because you don't like that they're different just makes you another monster that deserves to be locked up. Thanks so much for letting me tell you this story. If you're a fan of true crime, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. You can also hit like or leave a comment. If you'd like to support the show, check out our merchandise at thisismonsters.com. The link is in the description. Thanks again, and be safe.